If you ever get into the wrong car, pray it's not owned by a billionaire who's about to change your life forever. The rain came down in sheets over Manhattan, blurring headlights into streaks of gold and white as Maya Johnson sprinted across the slick sidewalk, her worn sneakers splashing through shallow puddles, her breath sharp in her chest as she checked her phone again, the rideshare app blinking weakly through a cracked screen, 1 bar of battery left, driver arriving in 2 minutes, black sedan, license plate ending in 7K9. She muttered it under her breath like a lifeline, her jacket thin and damp, clinging to her arms as the wind cut through it like paper. And when a sleek black car pulled up to the curb just 10 feet ahead of her, she didn't hesitate, didn't double-check, didn't question why a car that polished would be hers for a $12 ride. She just ran, yanked open the back door, and slid inside, pulling it shut behind her with a breathless, sorry, traffic's insane tonight. Her voice rushing out before she even looked up, and the moment the door sealed, the world outside went quiet. The storm reduced to a muted drum against tinted glass, the air inside warm, still, expensive in a way she couldn't quite name, like leather and something subtle, clean, controlled. She exhaled, leaning back, wiping rain from her forehead. You're a lifesaver. I swear, if I'm late again my manager's gonna. She stopped, just for a second, because something felt off, not wrong, not yet, just different. Like stepping into a place that didn't belong to you but hadn't rejected you either. And in the front seat, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, Ethan Carter watched her through the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable, his tailored suit still crisp despite the storm outside, his watch catching a faint glint of passing streetlight. He had been waiting for his driver, not for this, not for a woman who looked like she had run straight through the city just to land in his car. But he didn't correct her. Not when she assumed, not when she smiled in that tired, apologetic way that didn't ask for permission to exist. He just said nothing, and when silence stretched a beat too long, Maya filled it the only way she knew how, with words. I'm headed to 8th and Madison. Should be quick. I mean, well, not quick, but you know what I mean. She gave a small laugh, the kind people use when they're trying to soften the edges of a long day. And Ethan's fingers tightened just slightly on the wheel before he eased the car back into traffic, merging smoothly as if this had been the plan all along. The city lights sliding across the windshield in slow motion, and in the mirror he studied her. The way her hair curled slightly from the rain, the way her hands rubbed together for warmth, the way she sat carefully, like she was trying not to take up too much space in a car that clearly had more than enough. And for the first time in a long time, something unfamiliar stirred in him, not curiosity exactly, not yet, but attention, real attention, the kind he couldn't buy. And in the back seat, Maya let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Seriously though, thank you, she said softer now, glancing toward the front. Most drivers would have canceled in this weather. She paused, then added with a small shrug. Guess not everyone's out here trying to make someone else's night worse. Ethan's eyes flicked to hers in the mirror, just for a second, and something about the way she said it, not bitter, not even angry, just honest, landed heavier than it should have. And outside, the rain kept falling. But inside the car, something had shifted, something neither of them had planned, and neither of them fully understood yet. Because Maya still thought she had just gotten lucky with a ride, and Ethan Carter, one of the most powerful men in the city, had just made a decision he couldn't take back. He chose not to tell her she was in the wrong car. The city blurred past them in streaks of light as Maya leaned forward slightly, peeking between the seats like she had done 100 times in 100 rides, completely unaware that this one was different. You ever notice how the city feels slower in the rain? She asked casually, her voice softer now, more grounded, as if the chaos outside had finally settled into something manageable. Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes fixed on the road, but his attention was entirely on her on the way she spoke without hesitation, without calculation, like she was not trying to impress anyone. People usually complain about traffic, he said finally, his tone even, controlled, but there was a hint of curiosity beneath it. Maya shrugged, pulling her damp sleeves down over her hands. Yeah, but traffic means people are going somewhere. You know, like they still have somewhere to be. She let out a small laugh. Some days that is enough. Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened just slightly again, not from tension, but from recognition, the kind that hits quietly, unexpectedly, because in a world where everything was scheduled, optimized, and controlled, he had not thought about something as simple as movement meaning purpose, not in a long time, and the silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was different, and Maya filled it again, not because she had to, but because she always did. Sorry, I talk a lot when I am tired, she added quickly. Long shift, double actually, and I still have to make it to the next one. She shook her head, half amused, half exhausted. Life does not really wait, does it? Ethan glanced at her in the mirror again, this time longer, studying the way she said it like it was a fact she had already accepted instead of something she was fighting against. What do? He asked, the question simple, but deliberate. Maya hesitated for just a fraction of a second, then answered honestly. Waitress, mostly, sometimes retail when they need extra help. Depends on the week. She gave a small shrug. Nothing glamorous, but it keeps the lights on. Most of the time, she paused, then added with a faint smile, what about you? The question hung there for a moment, and for the first time that night, Ethan considered the truth, the real answer, the one that would end this strange, unexpected moment immediately. CEO, Carter Industries, one of the largest tech firms on the East Coast, a name that opened doors before he even walked into the room. But instead, he said, I work in business. The words intentionally vague, almost casual. Maya nodded like that was enough, because for her, it was, business sounds important, she said lightly. Or at least stressful. Ethan almost smiled. Almost. But it faded before it could fully form, because stress was not the word he would have used, not anymore, something like that, he replied, and the car slowed at a red light, the glow casting soft reflections across the windshield. And for a brief second, everything felt still again. Maya shifted in her seat, reaching into her bag, pulling out a crumpled $10 bill. She smoothed it out carefully between her fingers like it mattered, like it was the last piece of something she could not afford to lose. And when the light turned green, she leaned forward and held it out toward the front. Here, she said simply. I know the app handles it, but you showed up in this weather, so. Her tone was matter of fact, not generous, not performative, just fair. Ethan did not take it right away, his eyes flicking to the bill, then back to the road. You do not have to do that, he said, his voice quieter now, and Maya tilted her head slightly, confused by the hesitation. I know I do not have to, she replied, just as calm. I want to. And there it was again, that same unfiltered honesty, no expectation, no hidden agenda, just a simple decision. And slowly, almost reluctantly, Ethan reached back and took the bill, his fingers brushing hers for the briefest moment. And something about that contact, that exchange, felt heavier than it should have, not because of the money, but because of what it represented. And Maya leaned back again, satisfied, like a transaction had been completed, like the balance of the moment had been restored. See, she said softly, not everyone is trying to take more than they give. Ethan did not respond this time, because he could not without breaking whatever this was, whatever strange, fragile connection had formed between two people who should never have met like this. And as the car turned onto her street, the buildings grew smaller, older, the glow of the city dimming into something quieter, something more real. Maya straightened slightly, glancing out the window. You can drop me here, she said, pointing toward the corner. I can walk the rest. Ethan slowed the car, but he did not stop immediately, his eyes still on her through the mirror, as if trying to understand something he had not felt in years, something he could not control. And for the first time since she got in the car, Maya noticed the silence stretching again. Different this time, heavier, and she frowned just slightly. Hey, you okay? She asked, and Ethan finally met her eyes directly. Not through the mirror, but turning just enough for the moment to feel real. Yeah, he said, his voice low, steady, but there was something beneath it now, something new. I am just thinking. Maya smiled faintly, pushing the door open as the rain softened outside. Careful with that, she said lightly, stepping out into the night. Thinking too much will slow you down. And with that, she closed the door, disappearing into the dim glow of the streetlights, leaving behind a silence that felt louder than anything she had said. and in the front seat. Ethan Carter sat still for a long moment, the $10 bill still in his hand, realizing that for the first time in years, something had just happened that he could not predict, could not control, and could not forget. The rain had slowed to a quiet drizzle by the time Maya reached the corner, but the cold had settled deep into her bones, the kind that did not come from weather alone. She pulled her jacket tighter around herself as she walked the last block to the diner, its neon sign flickering faintly above the door, casting a tired glow onto the sidewalk. And for a moment she paused, looking at her reflection in the glass, damp curls framing her face, shoes worn thin at the soles, eyes that looked older than 24, but steady, always steady. She pushed the door open and was immediately met with the familiar hum of late-night voices, clinking dishes, and the smell of coffee that had been sitting too long on the burner. "You are late." Her manager's voice cut through the noise before she could even take 2 steps inside. Maya did not flinch, did not apologize right away. She simply walked behind the counter, tying her apron with practiced hands. 5 minutes, she said calmly, glancing at the clock on the wall. The rain slowed everything down. He shook his head, already irritated. "Excuses do not pay bills," he muttered, loud enough for the other staff to hear. And Maya felt the shift, the subtle glance from a coworker, the unspoken judgment that always seemed to follow moments like this. But she kept moving, picking up a tray, checking orders, because stopping meant feeling. And feeling meant losing time she did not have. "Table 7 needs coffee," someone called out, and she nodded, stepping into the rhythm of the place, the one thing she could control. And as she poured the dark liquid into chipped mugs, she let her mind drift for just a second, back to the car, to the quiet, to the way the world had felt, different, not easier, not better, just lighter. She shook the thought away quickly, because that was not her world, not really. That was a moment, and moments did not pay rent, did not cover overdue notices stacked on her kitchen counter, did not fix the fact that she had exactly $38 left until Friday. And she moved faster, because that was how she survived, by not staying still long enough for reality to catch up. "Hey." A voice interrupted her thoughts, one of the newer waitresses leaning against the counter, her tone casual but edged with something else. "You ever think maybe you should find something better?" Maya glanced at her briefly, already knowing what was coming. "Better how?" she asked, keeping her voice even. "You know," the girl shrugged, lowering her voice slightly. "Somewhere a little more polished." The word hung there, heavier than it should have been, and Maya met her eyes for a second longer than necessary, not defensive, not angry, just clear. "This pays my bills," she said simply, turning back to her work, because she had learned a long time ago that not every comment deserved a reaction. And the girl huffed softly, walking away, but the air had shifted again, just enough for Maya to feel it. Just enough to remind her that no matter how hard she worked, how early she showed up, how late she stayed, there were always lines drawn that had nothing to do with effort and everything to do with perception. And she exhaled slowly, steadying herself, because she did not have the luxury of letting it get to her. Not tonight. Not when she still had 6 hours left on her shift. And across the city, in a penthouse that overlooked the skyline she barely had time to notice, Ethan Carter stood by a floor-to-ceiling window, the rain now nothing more than faint streaks against the glass, the city glowing beneath him like something distant, something detached. But his attention was not on the view. It was on the small, crumpled $10 bill resting in his hand. He had not put it away, had not even set it down, as if doing so would make the moment disappear entirely. And that was something he was not ready to let go of yet. His assistant's voice came through the open doorway behind him. "Your 9 o'clock meeting has been moved to tomorrow morning," she said, efficient, composed. "And the board is asking for a final decision on the expansion proposal." Ethan did not respond right away, and after a brief pause, she added, "Is everything all right?" He looked down at the bill again, then out at the city, then finally spoke. "Find out where she works." The words came out quieter than expected, but firm. His assistant hesitated, just slightly. "Who?" she asked, and Ethan's reflection in the glass shifted as he turned his head just enough to answer. "The woman from tonight," he said. "I want to know everything." And back. At the diner, Maya balanced 3 plates on her arm, weaving through tables with practiced ease, unaware that somewhere above the city lights, a man who had everything had just decided he needed to find her again, not because he lacked options, but because for the first time in years, something real had slipped into his world without asking for permission, and he was not going to let it disappear that easily. The night stretched on inside the diner, the clock hands dragging slower with each passing minute as Maya moved between tables, her steps automatic now, her smile practiced, her mind split between the orders in front of her and the quiet weight of everything waiting outside those doors. And yet, somewhere beneath the exhaustion, something lingered from earlier, something she could not quite shake, the memory of a quiet car, a stranger who listened instead of interrupting, a moment that felt out of place in a life that rarely allowed for anything unexpected. She pushed the thought aside as she refilled another cup of coffee, because distraction was a luxury she could not afford. "Maya, table 4 is asking for you," the manager called out, his tone sharp, and she nodded, wiping her hands on her apron before heading over, already preparing herself for whatever complaint might be. Waiting, but when she reached the table, she paused, just slightly, because the man sitting there did not look like the usual late-night customer. His suit was too clean, his posture too composed, his presence too deliberate, and for a brief second, something in her chest tightened, not recognition exactly, but something close to it. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady, professional, and the man looked up, meeting her eyes with a calm that felt familiar. "I was hoping you could," he said, and Maya blinked, the voice hitting her before the face fully registered. The same controlled tone, the same quiet weight behind simple words, and suddenly, the pieces shifted into place, not all at once, but enough for her to feel it, that subtle pull of something unexpected returning. "You," she said softly, before she could stop herself, and Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile to touch his expression, not the kind meant for meetings or negotiations, but something quieter, something real. "Me," he replied, and for a moment, the noise of the diner seemed to fade just enough for the space between them to feel clearer, more focused. Maya straightened slightly, her mind catching up to the moment. "What are you doing here?" she asked, not suspicious, not defensive, just genuinely surprised, and Ethan leaned back just enough to appear casual, though nothing about his presence truly was. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, the words simple, but the intention behind them far more deliberate than he let on. Maya raised an eyebrow slightly, a faint hint of amusement breaking through her exhaustion. "In this neighborhood?" she echoed, glancing briefly around the diner, as if to emphasize the point, and Ethan followed her gaze for a second before returning his attention to her. "I thought I would stop by," he added, and there was something in the way he said it that made it clear he was not here by accident. "Not really," and Maya let out a small breath, shaking her head lightly. "You do realize most people do not go looking for coffee at 2 in the morning unless they have to," she said, and Ethan's expression softened just slightly. "Maybe I am not most people," he replied, and the honesty in that statement, even without explanation, landed in a way that made her pause, just for a second, because she had already sensed that the night before, in the quiet of that car, that he was different, though she had not known how. And now, standing here in the bright, unforgiving lights of the diner, that difference felt more real, more present. "What can I get you?" she asked, shifting back into her role, because that was safer, easier, something she understood, and Ethan glanced at the menu briefly, though it was clear he was not really reading it. "Coffee," he said. "Black." Maya nodded, jotting it down out of habit even though she would remember it anyway. "Coming right up," she replied, and as she turned to leave, Ethan spoke again. "You work a lot," he said, not as a question, but as an observation, and Maya paused, glancing back at him. "Enough," she answered simply, because explaining more would require time she did not have, and feelings she did not have space for. She moved back behind the counter, pouring a fresh cup, her hands steady even as her thoughts began to shift again, because this was not normal, none of it was. People did not just reappear like this, not in her world, not without a reason, and yet, when she returned to the table and set the cup down in front of him, she did not ask why he was really there. She just met his eyes for a brief moment, and something unspoken passed between them again, something that felt just as unexpected as the first time, and across from her, Ethan wrapped his hands lightly around the warm cup, but his attention never left her, because he had seen boardrooms, cities, entire industries bend under pressure, but none of it had held his attention the way this did. The way she did, not because she was trying to, but because she was not. And as Maya stepped away to continue her shift, she told herself it was just a coincidence, just a customer, just another moment that would pass like all the others. But something in the way he had looked at her, not past her, not through her, but at her, made it harder to believe that this was something she could simply walk away from. And for the first time that night, the rhythm of her routine felt slightly off, just enough for her to notice, just enough to know that something had already begun to change. The diner had begun to thin out as the night crept closer to morning, the rush fading into scattered conversations and the occasional clink of silverware. But Maya's pace did not slow. It never did, because slow meant falling behind, and falling behind meant questions she could not afford to answer. Yet despite her focus, her awareness kept drifting back to table 4, to the man who did not belong in a place like this, and yet sat there like he had nowhere else to be, his coffee untouched for longer than any customer would normally allow, his attention steady, patient, and for reasons she could not fully explain, that unsettled her more than any rude comment or long shift ever could. "You are staring," her coworker whispered as she passed by, nudging her lightly, and Maya immediately looked away, shaking her head. "I am working," she replied under her breath, though even she knew it was not entirely true, because something about him had pulled her attention without asking, without effort, and that alone made her cautious. "If he tips like he dresses, I would not mind a little staring," the coworker added with a quiet laugh before walking off, and Maya exhaled slowly, steadying herself before picking up another order, because assumptions like that were dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they simplified things that were never simple. And when she finally made her way back to his table, she forced her focus into place. "Need a refill?" she asked, reaching for his cup, and Ethan looked up, his gaze meeting hers with the same calm intensity that made it difficult to look away. "I am fine," he said, then after a brief pause. "But you are not." The words caught her off guard, not because of what he said, but because of how easily he said it, like it was obvious, like it was something he had already decided. And Maya let out a small breath, setting the coffee pot down carefully. "That is a bold assumption for someone who does not know me," she replied, her tone light, but edged with something firmer beneath it, and Ethan did not flinch, did not backtrack. He simply leaned back slightly, considering her for a moment before speaking again. "You work 2 jobs, you barely stopped moving since I got here, and you still tipped me last night when you could not afford to," he said evenly. "That is not fine." Maya's expression shifted just slightly, the smallest crack in her composure, because he had noticed, not just what she did, but what it meant, and that was not something she was used to, not from strangers, not from anyone. "You do not know what I can or cannot afford," she said quietly, her voice more controlled now, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging the boundary without pushing past it. "You are right," he said, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the air between them settling into something more grounded, less uncertain, and Maya picked up his cup again, refilling it this time without asking, more out of habit than intention. "People like you do not usually come back," she said after a moment, her voice softer, less guarded, and Ethan tilted his head slightly. "People like me," he repeated, and Maya gave a faint, almost amused smile. "You know exactly what I mean," she replied, glancing briefly at his suit, his watch, the way he carried himself like the world adjusted around him instead of the other way around, and Ethan followed her gaze, then looked back at her. "Maybe I am not here for the reasons you think," he said, and Maya let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Everyone is always here for a reason," she answered. "Some just hide it better than others." And there it was again, that clarity, that refusal to pretend things were simpler than they were, and Ethan found himself leaning forward slightly, drawn in by it. "What do you think my reason is?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a genuine question, and Maya paused, considering him for a moment before answering. "I think you are curious," she said, her eyes meeting his directly now. "About something that does not fit into your world the way you expect it to." Ethan held her gaze, the accuracy of her words settling in deeper than he anticipated, because she was not wrong, not even close, and for the first time in a long time, he did not have an immediate response, not one that felt sufficient, and Maya stepped back slightly, breaking the moment before it could stretch too far. Careful with that, she added lightly, gesturing toward him. Curiosity can be expensive. Ethan almost smiled again. This time it lingered just a fraction longer. I can't afford it, he said, and Maya raised an eyebrow, a hint of challenge in her expression now. That is what people always think, she replied, before turning to head back toward the counter, leaving him with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold and a conversation that had somehow shifted into something neither of them had planned. And as she moved through the diner once more, Maya tried to convince herself that this was still just a customer, just another interaction in a long night of them. But the truth settled quietly beneath that thought, undeniable and steady. This was not something she could file away and forget, not anymore. And across the table, Ethan Carter watched her disappear into the rhythm of her world, realizing that for the first time in years, he was not the one in control of the narrative unfolding in front of him, and he was not entirely sure he wanted to be. By the time the first hint of dawn softened the edges of the sky, the diner had settled into that quiet in-between hour where the world seemed to pause, not asleep, but not fully awake either, and Maya finally allowed herself to slow down, just slightly, wiping down the counter with steady hands as the last few customers filtered out, her body aching in that familiar, dull way that came from pushing through exhaustion instead of resting from it. And when she glanced toward table 4 again, she noticed he was still there, still sitting with that same composed stillness, as if time moved differently for him. And something about that made her hesitate before approaching, because this was no longer just a customer staying too long. This was a choice, and she needed to understand why. You are going to miss whatever it is people like you usually do in the morning, she said as she stepped up to the table, her tone light but edged with curiosity, and Ethan looked up, as if he had been expecting her to return. What makes you think I have somewhere else to be? He asked, and Maya let out a small breath, glancing toward the windows where the first pale light was beginning to push through the night. Everyone has somewhere else to be, she replied. Some of us just do not have the option to ignore it. Ethan considered that for a moment, then nodded slightly. That sounds exhausting, he said, not as a judgment, but as an observation, and Maya gave a faint, almost tired smile. It is, she admitted, surprising herself with the honesty, because she did not usually say that part out loud, not to anyone, especially not to someone like him. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the quiet stretching into something more comfortable than before, less uncertain, more intentional. What time do you get off? Ethan asked after a moment, and Maya raised an eyebrow slightly, not offended, but cautious. Why? She countered, and Ethan did not hesitate. Because I would like to continue this conversation somewhere that does not involve you working at the same time, he said simply, and the directness of it caught her off guard, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was clear, unfiltered, and she studied him for a second, trying to find the angle, the expectation, the part where this turned into something she had learned to avoid, but she did not see it. Not yet. You do realize I do not even know your name, she said finally, crossing her arms lightly, and Ethan paused, just for a fraction of a second, before answering. Ethan, he said, leaving out the part that usually followed, the last name that carried weight, recognition, assumptions, and Maya nodded slowly. Maya, she replied, as if they were meeting for the first time instead of continuing something that had started by accident. Nice to officially meet you, he said, and there was something almost ironic in the way he said it, something that made her exhale softly. I get off in about 20 minutes, she said after a moment, surprising herself again, because she had not planned to say yes, had not even considered the possibility seriously until it was already happening, and Ethan nodded once, as if that was all he needed. I will wait, he said, and for reasons she could not fully explain, that simple statement landed heavier than anything else he had said that night, because people did not usually wait for her, not like that, not without a reason tied to something they wanted in return, and as she turned to finish her shift, her thoughts shifted again, not distracted this time, but focused in a different way, aware of something new unfolding just beneath the surface. And 20 minutes later, as she untied her apron and grabbed her jacket, she stepped outside into the early morning air, the city quieter now, the rain gone, leaving behind that clean, sharp scent that only came after a storm. And there he was, leaning casually against the same black car, hands in his pockets, as if he had been there the entire time, as if waiting was not something unusual for him. And Maya stopped for a second, taking in the scene, the contrast of him against the worn edges of the street, the way it still did not quite make sense. "You actually stayed," she said as she approached, her tone carrying a hint of disbelief, and Ethan pushed off the car slightly, meeting her halfway. "I said I would," he replied, and she studied him again, trying to place him, to understand how someone like him fit into any version of her reality. And for the first time, she allowed herself to ask the question she had been holding back. "So what do you really do, Ethan?" she asked, her voice calm but direct, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment, knowing that the truth would change everything, knowing that this fragile, unexpected connection balanced on a line he had been carefully avoiding. And instead of answering directly, he opened the passenger door, stepping aside slightly. "Let me give you a ride," he said, echoing the night before. But this time, the moment felt different, heavier, more deliberate, and Maya looked at the car, then back at him. The memory of how all of this had started flickering through her mind, and after a brief pause, she let out a small breath, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "Only if you promise this time it is actually my ride," she said, and Ethan's expression softened just enough to reveal something real beneath the surface. "I promise," he replied, even though they both knew this was no longer just about a ride anymore. The morning light stretched across the windshield as Maya settled into the passenger seat, this time slower, more aware, her eyes taking in details she had missed before, the smooth stitching of the leather, the quiet hum of the engine, the way everything inside felt deliberate, controlled, like nothing was left to chance, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself out of habit even though the warmth inside the car made it unnecessary. "Okay," she said softly, glancing over at Ethan as he closed the driver's door and moved around to his seat. "This definitely is not a regular car." And there was a hint of humor in her voice, but beneath it, something more observant, more careful, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second before starting the engine, as if considering how much to say, how much to continue holding back. "It gets me where I need to go," he replied simply, and Maya let out a small breath, leaning back slightly as the car eased into motion, the city around them slowly waking up, delivery trucks lining the streets, early commuters moving with purpose, a different rhythm than the one she had just left behind. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence not uncomfortable, but filled with something unspoken, something building. "So," Maya said finally, breaking it gently, "you always pick up strangers in the middle of a storm, or was I just lucky?" Ethan glanced at her briefly before returning his eyes to the road. "I do not usually pick up anyone," he said, and Maya tilted her head slightly, studying him. "But you did," she pointed out, and he nodded once. "I did." And that was all he offered, but it was enough to shift the air between them again, because it meant something, even if neither of them named it out loud. And Maya looked out the window, watching the city pass by in a blur of movement and light. "You know," she said after a moment, her voice quieter now, more thoughtful, "most people would have told me I was in the wrong car." Ethan's grip on the wheel tightened just slightly, and he exhaled slowly. "I thought about it," he admitted, and Maya turned her head, her expression curious. "What stopped you?" she asked. And for a moment, Ethan did not answer, not because he did not know, but because the truth felt too simple, too revealing. "You seemed like you needed the ride," he said finally, and Maya held his gaze. For a second longer than before, something in her expression softening, just slightly. Not fully trusting, but not dismissing it either. "That is not a normal answer," she said, and Ethan allowed a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "I am not always normal," he replied, and Maya let out a quiet laugh, shaking her head. "Yeah, I am starting to figure that out," she said, and as the car turned onto a wider street, the buildings around them grew taller, cleaner, more polished, and Maya noticed the shift immediately, the subtle change in the environment that signaled a different part of the city, a different level of access. And she frowned slightly. "Hey, this is not the way to my place," she said, her tone calm but alert, and Ethan slowed the car just enough to glance at her. "I know," he said, and that single sentence shifted everything, the ease of the moment tightening into something more uncertain, and Maya straightened slightly in her seat, her body instinctively preparing for the unknown. "Then where are we going?" she asked, her voice steady, but no longer relaxed. And Ethan hesitated, just for a second, before answering. "Breakfast," he said, as if it were obvious, and Maya blinked, the tension easing just slightly, though not completely. "Breakfast?" she repeated, and Ethan nodded. "You have been working all night," he said. "You should eat." Maya studied him carefully, weighing the words, the intention behind them, and for a moment, she did not respond, because offers like that always came with something attached, something expected, and she had learned to be careful, to question, to protect what little control she had over her own life. "And what do you get out of it?" she asked finally, her eyes steady on his, and Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "Conversation," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no hidden implication, just a simple answer that somehow carried more weight than anything complicated could have, and Maya leaned back slowly, considering it, the city continuing to move around them, the distance between her world and his becoming more visible with each passing block, and after a long moment, she exhaled, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly. "Fine," she said. "But if this turns into something weird, I am leaving." And Ethan nodded once, accepting the condition without argument. "That seems fair," he replied, and as the car continued forward, the sun finally breaking through the clouds, casting a soft golden light across the dashboard, Maya glanced out the window again, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. And for the first time since this all began, she allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding. This was no longer just a coincidence, no longer just a wrong turn in the rain. This was something else, something she did not understand yet, and that uncertainty both unsettled and intrigued her in equal measure. And beside her, Ethan Carter drove in silence, aware that every mile forward was bringing them closer to a moment he could not avoid forever, the moment when she would learn who he really was, and everything would change. The car slowed as it turned into a quiet street lined with glass-front cafes and clean sidewalks that looked like they had never seen a cracked tile or flickering light, and Maya felt it immediately, that subtle shift in atmosphere, the kind that told you without words that this place was not built for people like her, not because it was unwelcoming, but because it had never considered her at all. "This is nice," she said carefully, her voice neutral, but her eyes taking in everything. The polished storefronts, the people dressed like their mornings had purpose instead of survival, and Ethan pulled the car to a smooth stop in front of a corner cafe where soft music drifted faintly through the glass doors. "It has good food," he said, as if that was the only detail that mattered, and Maya let out a small breath, unbuckling her seatbelt slowly. "I am starting to think you do not do anything halfway," she said, stepping out of the car, the cool morning air brushing against her skin. And Ethan joined her on the sidewalk, his presence drawing a few subtle glances from passers-by, the kind of recognition that Maya noticed immediately even if she did not yet understand it. "I prefer not to," he replied, holding the door open for her as they stepped inside, and the warmth of the cafe wrapped around them, the scent of fresh coffee and baked bread filling the air, a quiet contrast to the late-night diner she had just left. And for a moment, Maya hesitated, just slightly, because stepping into a place like this felt different, not intimidating exactly, but unfamiliar in a way that made her more aware of herself, of her clothes, her shoes, the traces of a long night still clinging to her. But she moved forward anyway, because turning back was not something she allowed herself to do easily, and they were led to a table by the window, sunlight filtering in softly, casting everything in a warm, almost unreal glow, and as Maya sat down, she glanced at the menu, though her attention was split. Part of her focused on the prices she had no intention of paying, part of her still trying to understand the man sitting across from her. "This place probably charges $10 for coffee," she said lightly, though there was a truth beneath the humor. and Ethan glanced at the menu briefly before setting it down. Then I will make sure it is worth it, he replied, and Maya shook her head with a faint smile. You really do not think like most people, she said, and Ethan met her gaze. You noticed that already, he said, and for a moment, the ease returned, the conversation, settling into a rhythm that felt almost natural, almost effortless, until a man in a suit approached their table, not a server, but someone whose posture shifted the energy around them. Good morning, Mr. Carter, he said with quiet respect, and everything in that moment changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably. Maya's eyes flicked to Ethan, the name landing before the meaning fully formed, and Ethan's expression stilled just slightly, a subtle tightening that only someone paying close attention would notice. Good morning, he replied calmly, as if this were routine, as if nothing had just shifted. Your usual table is ready if you would prefer, the man added, and Ethan shook his head once. This is fine, he said, his tone leaving no room for further suggestion, and the man nodded, stepping back, but not before glancing briefly at Maya, a look that was not openly dismissive, but carried a quiet question, one she recognized all too well, and as he walked away, the silence at the table settled heavier than before, and Maya slowly lowered the menu, her eyes fixed on Ethan now, sharper, more focused. Mr. Carter, she repeated, her voice calm, but no longer light, and Ethan held her gaze, knowing the moment had arrived, the one he had delayed, the one he had chosen to delay, and for a second, he did not speak, not because he did not know what to say, but because he knew that whatever he said would not be enough to keep things the same. It is just a name, he said finally, and Maya let out a short breath, shaking her head slightly. No, she replied, her voice steady. It is not just a name. And she leaned back in her chair, the warmth of the cafe no longer reaching her the same way, because now everything felt different, sharper, clearer. The small detail she had ignored suddenly aligning into something undeniable. The car, the way people looked at him, the way he carried himself, the way he had avoided answering certain questions, and she met his eyes again, this time without hesitation. Who are you really? She asked, and the question did not carry fear, or even anger yet, just clarity, the kind that comes right before everything changes, and across from her. Ethan Carter sat in silence for a moment longer, the world he had carefully kept separate from hers finally beginning to overlap, knowing that whatever he said next would not just answer her question, it would redefine everything that had happened between them so far. The air between them shifted in a way that could not be undone, the soft warmth of the cafe now feeling distant, almost artificial, as Maya held his gaze, waiting, not impatiently, but with a quiet certainty that the truth was no longer optional, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling into something he had anticipated but not fully prepared for. My name is Ethan Carter, he said, this time without leaving anything out, the words landing with a clarity that changed everything, and Maya did not react immediately, not with shock or disbelief, but with something far more controlled, far more deliberate. She leaned back slightly, her eyes narrowing just enough to process what that name meant, not just as a label, but as a position, a world, a level of power that did not intersect with hers by accident. Carter, she repeated softly, as if testing the sound of it, and then she let out a small breath, shaking her head once, not in confusion, but in realization. You are not just in business, she said, her voice steady, and Ethan did not look away. No, he admitted, and the honesty in that single word carried more weight than anything else he could have added. And for a moment, the noise of the cafe seemed to fade again, not because it actually did, but because everything else had become secondary to the understanding settling between them. You let me sit in your car, Maya said, her tone shifting now, not accusing, but no longer neutral. You let me talk to you like you were just normal. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in defense, but in recognition of what that implied. I did not stop you, he corrected quietly, and Maya let out a short, almost disbelieving laugh. That is the same thing, she replied, her eyes sharper now, clearer. You knew the whole time. Ethan nodded once, because denying it would only make it worse. Yes, he said, And the simplicity of the answer only made the space between them feel heavier, because there was no misunderstanding left to hide behind, and Maya looked down at the table. For a moment, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the menu, grounding herself in something real, something tangible, before she looked back up at him again. "Why?" she asked. And this time the question carried more than curiosity. It carried meaning, intention, a need to understand not just what he did, but why he chose to do it. And Ethan leaned forward slightly, his voice lower now, more direct. "Because you were not talking to me like I was this," he said, gesturing subtly to the space around them, to the attention he carried without asking for it. "You were just talking to me." Maya held his gaze, searching for something, anything that would make that answer feel sufficient, but instead, it only made the situation more complicated, more layered. "So you decided to let me believe something that was not true," she said, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not correct her, because that was exactly what had happened. "I decided not to take something away from you that you did not even know you had," he said finally, and the words hung there, heavier than either of them expected, because they were not entirely right, and not entirely wrong either. And Maya's expression shifted again, something softer flickering beneath the frustration, but not enough to erase it. "That is a nice way of saying you lied," she said quietly, and Ethan exhaled, the tension in his shoulders becoming more visible now, because this was not a negotiation, not a meeting, not something he could control with precision. "I did not tell you the truth," he said, choosing his words carefully. And Maya let out a breath, leaning back in her chair, the sunlight now feeling too bright, too exposing. "That sounds the same to me," she replied. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence no longer comfortable, but not entirely broken either. It simply existed, stretching between them as both of them processed what had been said, what had been revealed, and what could not be undone. "You should have told me," Maya added after a moment, her voice quieter now, less sharp, but no less certain, and Ethan nodded, because he knew that, had known it from the beginning. "I know," he said, and that was it, no excuse, no justification, just acknowledgement, and something about that, the lack of defense, the absence of manipulation, made it harder for Maya to hold on to the frustration the way she expected to. And she looked at him again, really looked at him, not the car, not the cafe, not the name, but the person sitting across from her. And for a brief second, she saw the same man from the night before, the one who had listened, who had stayed quiet, who had let her speak without interruption. And that realization complicated everything. "I do not fit into your world," she said. Finally, not as a question, but as a statement, and Ethan's response came without hesitation. "Maybe my world needs to change," he said, and the certainty in his voice caught her off guard more than anything else he had said so far, because it was not defensive, not dismissive, it was honest, and Maya held his gaze, the weight of that statement settling into something she could not easily dismiss, because if he meant it, if even a part of him meant it, then this was no longer just about a mistake or a misunderstanding. It was something else entirely, something she had not planned for. And as the server approached their table to take their order, the moment broke just enough for reality to return, but not enough to erase what had just happened. And as Maya picked up the menu again, her hands steady but her thoughts shifting, she realized that whatever this was, whatever had started in that car, it was no longer something she could walk away from without consequence, not for him, and not for herself. The moment the server walked away with their order, the fragile balance between them returned, but this time it carried weight, not uncertainty, not curiosity, but consequence. And Maya sat back in her chair, her arms loosely crossed, her posture no longer casual but grounded, deliberate, as if she was drawing a line she had not needed before. "You should have told me the moment I got into that car," she said, her voice calm but firm, and Ethan did not interrupt, did not try to soften it, because he knew she was right. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of it only made her exhale sharply, shaking her head slightly. "Do you?" she asked, her eyes locking onto his. "Because from where I am sitting, it feels like you got to have a version of me that did not know who you were, and I did not get the same choice." The words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried a precision that cut deeper than either of those things could have. and Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, not defensive, but present. "You are right," he said again, and this time the weight of it settled more fully between them. "I took that choice away from you." Maya studied him for a moment, searching for the part where he would justify it, where he would explain it in a way that made it easier for himself, but it did not come, and that, more than anything, unsettled her, because she had expected resistance, not agreement. "So what now?" she asked, and the question was not rhetorical. It was real, grounded in the understanding that whatever this was could not continue the way it had started, and Ethan held her gaze, the clarity of the moment forcing him into a position he was not used to, one where control was not guaranteed. "Now I tell you the truth," he said, and Maya let out a small breath, leaning back slightly. "You are a CEO," she said, not as a question, but as a statement she had already pieced together. "A big one." Ethan nodded once, "Yes," and she let out a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Of course you are," she said, glancing briefly around the cafe again, noticing the way people moved differently when he was present, the subtle attention, the recognition she had missed before, and she shook her head. "And you thought it would just be fine to sit there and let me talk about my life like we were equal." Ethan's expression shifted slightly, not offended, but thoughtful. "We were," he said, and Maya's eyes snapped back to his, sharper now. "No," she replied immediately. "We were not." And the tension rose again, not explosive, but undeniable. "You might think that because you can step into my world whenever you want, but I cannot step into yours like that," she added, her voice steady, each word carefully placed. "That is not the same thing." And Ethan listened, really listened, the way he had the night before, but now with a different understanding, a deeper awareness of what she was saying, not just the words, but the reality behind them. "You are right about that," he admitted, and Maya exhaled again, the frustration still there, but shifting, changing shape as it settled into something more grounded. "Then why are you still here?" she asked, and this time there was no edge to it, just a quiet, direct question that cut through everything else, and Ethan did not hesitate. "Not this time. Because I do not want this to end like that," he said, and the honesty in his voice was unmistakable, not polished, not calculated, just real, and Maya held his gaze, the simplicity of the answer making it harder to dismiss than anything more complex would have been. "You mean the version where I did not know who you were?" she said, and Ethan shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "The version where you were still talking to me." And for a moment, that landed differently, not erasing what had happened, not fixing it, but shifting something just enough to make her pause, and she looked down briefly, her fingers tracing the edge of the table again, grounding herself, before she looked back up at him. "You do not get to go back to that," she said quietly, and Ethan nodded, because he knew that too. "I am not trying to," he said. "I am trying to figure out what this is now." And the question hung there, not spoken directly, but present all the same, and Maya leaned back slightly, considering it, because walking away would be easier, cleaner, safer, but something about the way he had stayed, the way he had listened, the way he had not tried to control this moment, made it harder than it should have been. "This is complicated," she said finally, and Ethan allowed a faint, almost tired smile. "I have been told that before," he replied, and Maya shook her head slightly, a hint of something softer returning, not fully, but enough to change the tone of the moment. "Yeah, but this is not just complicated for you," she said, and Ethan's expression sobered again. "I know," he said, and for the first time since the truth came out, the silence that followed was not heavy with tension, but with something else, something quieter, something uncertain but not entirely broken. And as their food arrived, neither of them reached for it immediately, because the conversation between them had already shifted into something that could not be undone, something that would define whatever came next, whether they were ready for it or not. For a long moment, neither of them touched the food in front of them, the plates sitting untouched as if they belonged to another table. Another conversation, and Maya finally picked up her fork, more out of habit than hunger. "If I do not eat this, it is going to look like I came here just to argue with you," she said, her tone lighter now, though the tension beneath it had not completely disappeared, and Ethan allowed a small nod, reaching for his coffee instead. I would not recommend that, he replied, and for a brief second, something almost normal returned between them, something that felt like the beginning again, before everything had shifted, and Maya took a small bite, chewing slowly, her eyes still drifting back to him, studying, recalibrating, as if she was trying to understand how to place him now, not as the man from the car, not as the customer from the diner, but as both at once. And that was not simple, not something she could resolve in a single moment. So this is your world, she said after a minute, glancing around the cafe again. The quiet conversations, the polished surfaces, the ease with which everything seemed to function. Clean, quiet, expensive. Ethan followed her gaze, then looked back at her. It is just a place, he said, and Maya gave a faint, almost amused smile. It is never just a place, she replied. Places like this come with expectations, she paused, then added, and people who decide who fits into them. And the weight of that statement settled between them again, not sharply, but undeniably, and Ethan leaned back slightly, considering her words. And you think you do not fit here, he said, not as a challenge, but as an observation, and Maya shook her head slowly. It is not about what I think, she said. It is about what people decide the moment I walk in. And there was no bitterness in her voice, just clarity, the kind that came from experience, repeated enough times to become fact. And Ethan's expression shifted, something more serious settling in. Then maybe that is something that needs to change, he said, and Maya looked at him, really looked this time, not dismissing the idea, but not accepting it easily either. You say that like it is simple, she replied, and Ethan did not respond immediately, because he knew it was not for her, not for anyone who had spent years navigating spaces that were not built with them in mind. It is not simple, he admitted, but it is possible. And Maya let out a small breath, leaning back in her chair, her guard still present, but shifting, softening just slightly, because he was not dismissing her reality. He was acknowledging it, even if he did not fully understand it, and that mattered more than she expected it to. You are used to changing things, she said after a moment. That is what people like you do. And Ethan tilted his head slightly. People like me? He repeated, and Maya nodded once. The ones who get to decide how things work, she said, and Ethan held her gaze, the weight of that responsibility settling in a way it had not before, not in meetings, not in boardrooms, but here, in this moment, across from someone who lived with the outcomes of those decisions in a way he had never had to consider personally. Maybe I have been deciding the wrong things, he said, quietly, and the honesty in his voice caught her off guard again, not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, unpolished, and she studied him for a moment, the tension between them shifting into something more complex, less defined. That is a dangerous thing to realize, she said, and Ethan gave a faint nod. I am starting to understand that, he replied, and for a brief second, the space between them felt different again, not resolved, not easy, but open, like something new had been placed there instead of what had been broken, and Maya glanced down at her plate, then back at him. You cannot fix everything, she said, her tone softer now, not dismissive, but grounded. And you definitely cannot fix me. And Ethan shook his head slightly. I am not trying to fix you, he said. I am trying to understand you. And that landed differently, not as an attempt to control, but as something else, something that required patience instead of power. And Maya let out a quiet breath, the tension in her shoulders easing just enough for her to feel it. That might be harder, she said, and Ethan allowed a faint, almost genuine smile. I have time, he replied, and the simplicity of that statement lingered, because time was not something she had ever been able to rely on the same way, not something she could assume would always be there. And yet, sitting across from him, for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to pause, just for a moment, to exist in something that was not defined by urgency or survival. And as the morning light continued to fill the cafe, the conversation between them settled into a quieter rhythm, not fully resolved, not fully understood, but undeniably changed, because whatever this was, whatever had started as a mistake, had now become something neither of them could ignore, and neither of them seemed ready to walk away from it just yet. The moment they stepped out of the cafe, the world outside felt sharper, louder, more defined, as if the quiet space they had shared inside could not exist beyond those glass doors. And Maya pulled her jacket closer around her again, not because of the cold, but because something inside her had shifted, something she was still trying to understand, and Ethan walked beside her, matching her pace without effort, without trying to lead or control the direction. And for a few steps, neither of them spoke, the city filling the silence with distant traffic and the rhythm of people moving through their own mornings, until Maya stopped just short of the curb, turning to face him fully. "This is where it gets complicated," she said, her voice calm but grounded, and Ethan met her gaze, already knowing what she meant before she said it. "It already is," he replied, and Maya gave a faint, almost tired smile. "No," she said softly. "This is the part where it becomes real." And she gestured lightly between them, not dramatically, just enough to mark the space. "Whatever this is, it does not stay in a cafe. It does not stay in a car. It follows you back into your world and mine." Ethan listened, not interrupting, because he understood that this was not a rejection, not yet, but it was a boundary, one she needed to define clearly. "And your world is not built for me," she continued, her tone steady, not emotional, just factual. "Not your meetings, not your people, not the way they look at someone like me and decide who I am before I even speak." And Ethan's expression shifted slightly, something more serious settling in, because he had seen those looks, even if he had never been the one receiving them. "Then I changed that," he said, the words immediate, instinctive, and Maya shook her head gently. "You cannot just change people because you decide to," she replied, and there was no accusation in her voice, just reality, the kind that did not bend easily. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the certainty in his posture softening just enough to make space for what she was saying. "Maybe not all at once," he admitted, "but I can start." And Maya studied him for a moment, really studied him, as if trying to determine whether this was another version of control, another way of reshaping something to fit his world, or if it was something else entirely, something she had not expected. "And what happens when it gets uncomfortable?" she asked, her voice quieter now, but no less direct. "When people question you for bringing someone like me into your world, when they start looking at you differently because of it." Ethan did not hesitate. "Not this time." "Then they look," he said, and the simplicity of the answer caught her off guard, not because it was bold, but because it was not complicated, not defensive, just firm. And Maya let out a small breath, glancing down briefly before looking back up at him. "You say that like it does not matter," she said, and Ethan's gaze did not waver. "It does not matter more than this," he replied, and the way he said it, not loud, not dramatic, just certain, made something shift again, something subtle, but undeniable, and Maya felt it, even if she did not fully trust it yet. "You do not even know what this is," she said, and Ethan allowed a faint, almost reflective smile. "I know enough to know I do not want to walk away from it," he said, and for a moment, the world around them seemed to quiet again, not because it actually did, but because the space between them had become more focused, more real. And Maya crossed her arms lightly, not as a defense, but as a way to hold herself steady. "You are asking for something you cannot control," she said, and Ethan nodded once. "I know," he replied. "That is why it matters." And that landed differently, not as a challenge, not as a strategy, but as something genuine, something that did not fit neatly into the patterns she had learned to expect from people with power. And she looked at him for a long moment, weighing everything, the mistake that brought them here, the truth that followed, the difference in their worlds that could not be ignored, and the possibility, however uncertain, that something real existed in between all of that. "This does not get easy," she said finally, her voice steady. "Not for you, not for me." And Ethan met her gaze, his expression just as steady. "I am not looking for easy," he said, and Maya let out a quiet breath, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, not disappearing, but shifting into something more manageable, something she could hold without it overwhelming her. "Good," she said softly, because easy was never an option. And for a moment, neither of them moved, the city continuing around them, unchanged, while something between them had already begun to shift into something new, something that would not fit neatly into either of their worlds, but existed anyway. and as Maya turned slightly, stepping toward the street, she glanced back at him one more time, her expression no longer guarded in the same way, but not fully open either. "So what happens next?" she asked, and the question was no longer about the past, not about what had already happened, but about what they were choosing now, and Ethan stepped forward just enough to close the distance between them. His voice calm, certain. "Now we find out," he said, and for the first time since all of this began, the uncertainty did not feel like something to avoid, but something they were both willing to step into, even if neither of them knew exactly where it would lead. The car door clicked shut behind her, and for a moment Maya just stood there on the sidewalk, watching the city move around her like it always had, unchanged, steady, indifferent, but something inside her had shifted in a way she could not ignore, not anymore. And when she turned back, Ethan was still there, not walking away, not retreating into the world she had just described, but standing exactly where he said he would be, as if this moment mattered enough to hold his place in it. "You are still here," she said quietly, not surprised, but aware, and Ethan gave a small nod, his expression calm, but more open than it had been before. "I said I would be," he replied, and there was no performance in it, no weight of expectation, just a simple truth, and Maya took a slow breath, stepping a little closer, not enough to erase the space between them, but enough to acknowledge that it was there, that it mattered. "You realize this does not turn into some perfect story," she said, her voice steady, grounded in everything she had lived through. "There is no version of this where everything just works because we want it to." And Ethan did not interrupt, did not disagree. He simply listened, the way he had from the beginning, and when she finished, he nodded once. "I know," he said, and for a second, that was all that existed between them. The honesty of two people standing at the edge of something neither of them could fully define, and Maya studied him carefully, looking for hesitation, for doubt, for the moment where reality would catch up to intention, but it did not come, not in the way she expected. "So why stay?" she asked, the question softer now, not sharp, not defensive, just real, and Ethan stepped forward slightly, closing the distance just enough for his voice to feel more personal, more direct, "Because the version of me that let you walk away without trying is not someone I recognize anymore," he said, and the words settled between them with a quiet weight, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and Maya felt it, that shift, that difference between someone who was curious and someone who had made a decision, and she looked down for a moment, processing, before meeting his eyes again. "You are going to have to prove that," she said, and there was no challenge in it, no demand, just a boundary, a condition that existed because it had to, and Ethan nodded without hesitation. "I plan to," he replied, and the simplicity of it made her exhale softly, a faint, almost reluctant smile touching her expression, because for the first time, this did not feel like something being offered to her. It felt like something being built with her, slowly, carefully, without guarantees, and she glanced toward the street, then back at him. "I have to go home," she said, and Ethan stepped back slightly, giving her the space without being asked. "Then let me drive you," he said, and Maya paused. The memory of how all of this had started flickering through her mind, the rain, the mistake, the moment that should have ended as quickly as it began, and she shook her head lightly, a small smile forming now, more certain than before. "No," she said softly, "not this time." And Ethan raised an eyebrow slightly, not questioning, just waiting, and Maya met his gaze, her voice steady, clear. "If this is real, it does not start with me getting into your car again," she said, and the words carried meaning beyond their simplicity. A reminder of where they began, and a statement of where she wanted this to go, and Ethan held her gaze for a moment, then nodded slowly, understanding settling in. "Then how does it start?" he asked, and Maya took a step back, creating just enough distance to redefine the moment, to reshape it into something new, something intentional. "It starts with you meeting me halfway," she said, and for a second, the city seemed to pause around them, not in sound, but in feeling, because that was what this had always been about, not distance, not status, but whether two people could stand in the same space without one of them having to shrink or the other having to step down, and Ethan allowed a faint smile, one that reached his eyes this time. I can do that, he said, and Maya nodded once, accepting it, not as a promise, but as a beginning. And as she turned to walk down the street, her steps steady, her shoulders lighter than they had been before, Ethan remained where he was, watching her go, not with uncertainty, but with something else entirely, something that felt like purpose, like direction, like a path that had not existed before she stepped into his car. And as Maya disappeared into the rhythm of the city, she did not look back, not because she was unsure, but because for the first time, she did not need to, because whatever this was, it was no longer behind her, it was ahead, waiting to be discovered, one step at a time.